I'm so delighted to welcome my friend Tiffany Yu to Network Capital, who's written this fantastic book called The Anti-Ableist Manifesto, which is recently launched in the UK as well. I've known Tiffany now for almost a decade and been a small but hopefully meaningful part of the way she's talked about her work and the way she's made us all aware about the different nuances of this very important aspect of our lives, often overlooked. So, Tiffany, welcome back to Network Capital. Tell us a
Thank you
bit
so
about
much.
your journey, your professional, personal life, and then we'll weave our way into the book.
Yeah, so I guess I will start in the middle by sharing that Utkarsh and I met through this wonderful community that we were both a part of called the Global Shapers, which will play a role in the journey. But my entrance and my passion into this space comes based off my own lived experience. At the age of 9, I was involved in a car accident where my dad was driving. He unfortunately passed away, and I acquired a handful of injuries and disabilities, including permanently paralyzing one of my arms, breaking a couple bones in one of my legs that would leave me as a temporary wheelchair user for about 4 months, and much later being diagnosed with a mental health disability, PTSD, or post traumatic stress disorder. So, for about 10 years after I became disabled, I felt like I internalized a lot of shame because of the societal stigma around disability and didn't really have community or anything like that. Essentially just felt very isolated, alone, and excluded in my experience. And fast forward to, I guess, right around the time that Utkarsh and I met 10 years ago, I was looking for different social impact communities because I was looking to build my own community, which ultimately ended up being called diversibility. And diversibility to me is about not only ending the cycle of social isolation for disabled people, but part of how I think that this system of oppression known as ableism, which is the devaluing of disabled bodies and minds, part of how I think ableism gets its power is by making us think we have none. And part of how the system makes us think we have no power is by making us feel isolated and alone, making us feel like we don't have a voice or influence in community or in solidarity with each other. So, as a function of building diversibility, which is now this 80,000 plus digital network across platforms, our disability centered community, I thought about how we can close the attitudinal and perception gap around disability. Because in certain places like the US and the UK, we technically have laws and policies in place that should protect our rights in public spaces. But I also learned that if you don't have the hearts and minds and attitudes really seeing disabled bodies and minds as equal and not less than or dehumanized, then you're actually not going to implement those laws. So, in order to catch up to the law, which should be the floor, not the ceiling, how do we get the attitudes in place as well? And that's where the Anti-Ableist Manifesto came in.
Um, at Oxford, in one of the terms, I studied disability as one of the modules of my degree in philosophy. And it really opened my eyes, especially when doing research work for my paper. I found this quote by a philosopher who says that I am not your inspiration. And then she went on to expand on that. It's also a chapter in your book. So, as somebody who's been on World Economic Forum, TED, gone to Georgetown, worked at Goldman Sachs, very illustrious places, people would want to call you as inspirational. I wonder how you react to that and why might you be reticent to being anybody's inspiration?
Mm, such a good question. And I want to credit, and I don't know if if the philosopher you are citing, her name is Stella Young, but there was a TED talk by the late Stella
She
Young that was
is.
called
Yeah,
that
I
was
am.
called I Am Not Your
Yes, yeah,
Inspiration.
yeah.
But I guess so I will take a step back and start out with a question because you are getting your PhD in philosophy, which is if you took disability out of the equation, would you still describe that person that way? And if you would still describe Tiffany as inspiring for all of these accolades, then that's great. And I want to highlight there's a nuance between inspiration exploitation, or as Stella Young calls it, inspiration porn, and being inspired. So the nuance I will share is where inspiration exploitation comes into place is when we call a disabled person inspiring for having a job or getting up in the morning or uh, doing a daily task that, again, if you took the disability out of the picture, you wouldn't label that experience that way. That said, I would actually say that my experience of going through a tragic event and losing my father and finding my voice and my passion in this space can be inspiring. Because if you took the disability out of the picture and you have a story of a young girl who loses their father and figure out a way to empower other communities that she's a part of, I would find that inspiring. All of that to say, I can't force people how to feel. So even if someone thinks that Tiffany doing a daily life task because one of her arms is paralyzed is inspiring, what I would encourage that person to do, in addition to reflecting on that question, if you took a disability out of the picture, would you still label them? Would you still use that word to describe them? I would also turn that into action. And I will share that, and I think I shared this example at the end of the chapter in the book. But I remember giving a talk to a group of women technologists. This was at a tech conference. And at the end, I got a note from someone who had attended my talk, and she said, because of your talk, I've decided that I want to commit my career to tech accessibility and digital accessibility. Like, I felt so inspired and empowered by your talk that I am changing the trajectory of my career to focus on this community because I see it as a competitive advantage of really building my expertise in this space. That to me is a wonderful example of how we can turn inspiration into action. It's saying, okay, we know we have this feeling. There's something we can do with it, right? And the thing that we can do, again, helps to not only dismantle ableism or create a more accessible and inclusive world for all of us, but helps support this broader community and movement overall.
Uh, let's have a bit of a back and forth on what you just said. So, one might say that you're nudging people uh, to remove context from looking at something which is praiseworthy or achievement worthy. Again, my master's thesis in Oxford was on achievement. And one of the examples that a lot of philosophers say is that, say, tying a shoelace for a person who has two functional arms is not an achievement. But tying the shoelace, if one has one functional arm or one arm, uh, could be considered an achievement because it's significantly more difficult. And difficulty is one of the elements of looking at achievement. But you're probably adding a nuance to it. I'd love for our listeners to understand this.
Ooh, I love that example because I am someone who ties my shoelaces with one hand. But I guess what I in that actually specific example, and I like that you use the measure of difficulty. Part of the difficulty to me is the lack of access, right? So I actually now wear a pair of shoes where that has a zipper on the side. It also has shoelaces too, but it's very stylish and it has a little zipper
Mm,
right next to the laces. And so in that case, to me, I think about this through the lens and I actually love that you said that because I don't want to remove the context.
mm,
But I also don't want Tiffany having to put on, I don't want there to be a lever of difficulty that exists with putting on the shoes. So I come back, I guess, to the definition of inclusive design, which is how can we have multiple design variations so long as we achieve the desired outcome, right? And so the desired outcome in this case is to wear shoes, or, and you could challenge me by saying the desired outcome is tying the shoelaces, in which case there would be some level of difficulty involved depending on what your dexterity is and whether you are doing it with one hand or
Mm.
two hands. But in my case, I guess I'm looking at the broader goal, which is putting on shoes. And what levels of friction or difficulty are we inserting into that process that makes it so that disabled people or people of different types of disabilities experience more difficulty in that case? And then I ask the question because to me, society or design is placing the difficulty on. I wonder why does it have to be so difficult? But I actually love,
Mm.
and I would be fascinated to read this paper because I do think, and I like that challenge in the baseline of the tying of the shoes. And if you are using difficulty as a lever, but for me, tying the shoes is the means to an end, which is having your shoes on. uh, I guess I'm more concerned about what are the ways we can remove friction and difficulty from having a shoe on than the actual process in itself.
I think it's a very, very interesting philosophical debate, which we shall have maybe in a follow-up interview. But thank you very much for sharing it, because this is a bit of a debate, not just for disability, but also for lots of other kinds of inclusion efforts that are talked about. For example, gender, for example, many other issues. Should context be removed? If yes, what are the pros and cons? But you have lived experience, and you have put forward, and Stella Young and others have put forward a point of view, which is very important and needs to be considered. So thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your journey with it. But let's start from the basics. What is ableism and what is the Anti-Ableist Manifesto at a broad level?
Yes, so ableism, the definition that I use is that it's a system of oppression that devalues someone based on the way their body and or mind works. Or if you want to look at it through a disability lens, it's the devaluing of disabled bodies and disabled minds. Part of why my definition actually doesn't include the word disability in it, again, devaluing someone based on the way their body and or mind works, is we actually see intersectionality kind of come into play here, which says, uh, and I'm joining you from the US where we have devalued people based on their skin color. We've devalued their bodies. And this is where ableism and racism will intersect. We have devalued women based on, maybe even the tone of their voice, the way they speak, question their intellect. And this is where we see sexism and ableism intersect as well. If we look at what anti-ableism is, and then I'll go to what the Anti-Ableist Manifesto is, anti-ableism is what are the actions and strategies and processes that we can put in place where we're not devaluing people. And again, there are so many areas where we may be inadvertently devaluing someone, even in the example of the tying of the shoelaces. We're making an assumption that in order to do this, you will have access to both of your hands. Um, but that's where I come into the idea of like all the different, like even, and then even in the context of this book, I wrote the entire first draft of the book using speech to text technology.
Oh,
I spoke the whole, every chapter I spoke. Uh,
mhm.
and then I went and I looked at the rough transcript and, puzzle pieced it together because for me, as someone who can type with one hand, I can type an email or a short article, a 90,000 word book. I probably would be able to type that, but not without putting a lot of strain onto one hand, right? So again, multiple design variations. Desired
Mm.
outcome is you have a book. So the Anti-Ableist Manifesto is actually a piece of art that has a handful of statements on it. And the statements range from things like disability is not a bad word or a bad thing. We are not your inspiration, which we just spoke about. Design inclusively, which we've also chatted about. And these statements on here, they're about 30 statements on the manifesto, actually correspond with chapters in the book.
Yeah.
And as I was writing the book, and the chapters in the book are a little bit more descriptive than how they appear on the manifesto. But as I was writing the book, I thought about,
Do send this to me if you can. I'd love to put it on the website.
oh, the piece of art. Yes, yes, I will send that to you. But that was the idea is everyone can engage with a piece of art, right? And so I've turned the manifesto into a piece of art where hopefully there will be statement or statements on there that resonate with you. And to me, that's your entrance into this space. And actually, the manifesto, it sounds like you're in the process of reading the book. The manifesto is introduced in the conclusion. And I remember, and of course, I remember one of my readers said, "Oh, I wish the manifesto were introduced earlier in the book." And then I talked to another reader who said, I kind of like that it was introduced at the end because it can be overwhelming to someone if they don't understand all the terminology yet. And the book really takes you through a journey, a learning journey of, okay, let's start from the baseline of definitions and language, and then let's move to microaggressions or common ones that disabled people may experience to then what are the, again, systems and processes and policies that we can put in place. But and so the chapter on inspiration, I believe, is in section 2. The book takes you through a framework called Me, We, Us, which is actually a framework I learned as I was beginning my journey as a global shaper and wanting to learn more about social impact and transformative change and how we can create that type of change. But but yeah, so that's the manifesto. Uh, and yeah, depending on who you are, you can engage with a book, you can engage with a piece of art first. And if you honestly, if your first starting point is engaging with a piece of art, you can go off and do your own research too. And you can go, learn outside of the manifesto in book form.
I mean, the good thing about the art is that organizations can have them as part of, like, something hanging on the wall. People can take pictures. It can, go viral a bit faster than a book. But the
Yes.
advantage of multimedia platforms or platforms like Network Capital is that we'll be able to put forward this discussion, the link to get the book, and poster so that people can choose to apply this. Because to me, this is a philosophy and policy book, of course, written from, a reflective lens. And some of the philosophy angles we have discussed. Now let's come to policy. Before that, help us understand what are some of the common misconceptions about disability and the lack of synergy between the people making policies and the people who have, informed opinion on the subject of disability.
Ooh, I will answer that second part first. I think it comes down to the lack of representation. And again, the devaluing, the dehumanization, viewing our experience as less than, or even only as a singular narrative. So this is even coming and circling back to a common misconception and our conversation around inspiration. Part of why our community is sensitive around being described as inspiring, or people within our community are sensitive around that, is in some ways it objectifies us. And it says our only purpose is to inspire you. That is our only role in life, or for you to make you realize you don't have it as hard as we do, right?
Mhm.
In which case, I would take that whatever inspiration or objectification that had been created. And again, I want to turn that into action.
Mm.
Uh, but I think that's the disconnect with the policy. And at the same time, we have policies that are keeping that actually are ableist in themselves. So some examples here in the US is that it's still legal to pay disabled people below minimum wage in many states.
Cannot believe that. Wow.
Um, there are, if you receive disability benefits, you have asset caps of $2,000, meaning you can only have $2,000. Um, for some people, I think, and I haven't done, at least where I live in Los Angeles, to afford rent, I'm going to need more than $2,000. And that's asset, right? That includes your cars, your car, anything that you own, right? And so, that is still in place. And there are also uh, laws or policies that have come in place to help support that. So now here in the US, we have something called an ABLE account, which means that you can save up to $100,000. You can put up to $100,000 in a savings account that will go toward your disability expenses.
Mm,
But still, I think the uptake, the adoption of the ABLE accounts is not as high as we would like it to be. At the same time, if you want to pursue entrepreneurship, which a lot of disabled people are because of bias and prejudice and discrimination of not getting hired into traditional workplaces, again, if you make more than your asset or income caps, if you receive disability benefits, you may lose those benefits. At the same time, I think that's again where the ABLE accounts are trying to come in and be this in between to say, maybe you can allocate some of what you're making as an entrepreneur into the ABLE
mm,
account, which then goes um, into supporting disability expenses. It's still legal in the majority of US states to force sterilize disabled people as we talk about issues around reproductive justice. That is still happening. So we still have laws in place, like the one around paying disabled people below minimum wage has been around since I want to say 1934 or 1938. So sometime in the 1930s. So it's almost 100 years old. And you can actually go online and search Section 14C certificates and see all the employers who have these certificates where they're legally paying disabled people below minimum wage. There are policies that are actively devaluing us.
mm,
Then if I come over to the common misconceptions, I think the biggest one is around the assumptions that people make about what we can or can't do based on what they assume based on our disability, based on assumptions they're making around our disability.
mm,
And I call this the assumption funnel. So I'll share just two examples of the assumption funnel. One assumption funnel could be Tiffany only can only type with one arm. So we assume that she can't write a book, so we don't give her a book deal or we don't give her an
mm,
opportunity to write a book. Another assumption funnel could be, so I started my career in investment banking at Goldman Sachs. It could be like Tiffany can only, and these start with Tiffany only types with one arm. I'll think of some other ones, but Tiffany can only type with one arm. So we assume that she can't work on pitch decks or work on financial models in Excel. So we don't give her an opportunity to interview for a job, so she doesn't get the job, right? And so these assumptions are creating barriers like way down the line of the assumption funnel. So even if I think of a situation where we say, uh, there's a person who is a wheelchair user, and we assume that they don't go to concerts. So we don't make the concert venue accessible. So the person who's a wheelchair user is not coming to the concert, right? Because they can't even come to the venue.
mm,
Even in that one example, we can say, we assume that the person who's a wheelchair user doesn't have any friends. So when we design the concert venue, we of course will put in accessible seating, but we only put one seat in. So the person who's a wheelchair user is not sitting with their friends. And as a result, it impacts and if you do decide to go to the concert with your friend and you only have the one allocated seat for the person who's a wheelchair user, they're now sitting separate from their friends, not deepening the connections. And so it impacts their relationship. So then maybe ultimately it does put a strain on their friendships, right?
right.
And so yeah, and I will say I didn't get to write about the assumption funnel in the book, but it just became so
It's a really
clear to
interesting concept. Yeah.
yeah. And I will say, even to your point, one fun fact, I don't know if you know this, I was on a Dutch television series in 2017 called What's the Right Thing to Do? And it was
Mm.
with Harvard professor Michael Sandel, where we were going
Oh, I
through
know. I
all
did not know that. Yeah.
but you're actually making me reflect on And there were five different episodes where we ran into different, philosophical or different situations or different, we had different philosophical debates
Mm,
around a whole handful of things. So you're kind of making me revisit that in our little mini debates here. But yeah, but I think that's probably the biggest one is the assumptions that we make. Or it could even be an assumption around this candidate who is applying for a process, who is applying for this job has a disability, and we assume that the accommodations are going to be too difficult for us, so we don't interview them in the first place so that we don't have to deal with the accommodations.
mm,
Um, Again, making the assumption that disabled people don't exist in workspaces. There was the assumption that disabled people don't go to concerts or that disabled people don't have friends or don't write books, right? And so then part of it again comes back to as we start to have more representation in all of these different areas, I think it takes us out of that singular narrative of Tiffany is all she is this disabled person who has a
mm,
paralyzed arm, right? And adds more color, which is part of why I really liked being part of the Shapers Network. I do think there may be some issues around or they're working on increasing representation there. I aged out as an alum at the time. Once you turned 33, you moved into an alumni group. But I was so grateful that while I was there, we created a small mini network called Shaping Disability, which were
mm,
all the different people who were working either full time or in projects in their hub. And we are able to host a conference called Shaping Disability as well, a 1 day summit that tapped on different areas. But this is also part of why we at Diversability we like to host something we call the year-round disability conference because we don't think it's just December 3rd, which is International Day of People with Disabilities. Here in the US, October and July are also big disability months because it's the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act in July. That's Disability Pride Month. And then October has been National Disability Employment Awareness Month. But outside of talking about pride and employment, can we also look at we've hosted an event around disability and home ownership. We've hosted an event on, I don't know, of course, disability in the workplace, disability and technology. Like disability intersects every single different area. Can we start to look at either where ableism exists in those spaces or the different nuances that may occur? We even hosted an event that was on disability and gender-based violence and the way that violence may show up differently when you have a disability because the person who's the perpetrator may also be your caregiver or it's not just an
mm.
intimate partner. Uh, so yeah, so we're looking at all different areas.
Yeah. I thank you for sharing this. I did not know about your experience with Sandel. He comes up a lot on issues of justice and talking about meritocracy, and it does apply to this debate. So appreciate it. I'll take a look at the series. Tell me about the calls to action. So this book is directed to everybody. I don't think it's directed only to people who have a disability or not. It's a policy book because a large number of people suffer from disability, which is obvious and less obvious. I saw at Microsoft, where I used to work, the company became a lot more aware about the challenges that people face in the world of technology ever since the CEO Satya Nadella took in, and he has done some phenomenal work on that. He has lived experience through his children, and it reflects in the way the company has, taken it as a real call to action. Perhaps they should read the Anti-Ableist Manifesto. You should send it to him, by the way, this book, if you haven't already.
If you have
Um,
if you have a connection there, I'd be happy to to send it over. I do think one year maybe when I was at Davos and you were there too, maybe he
yeah, we
was
had invited, right? Like I invited him for our discussion there with Jean-Philippe.
yeah. Oh yeah, I do remember that.
But
But
anyway, you should
oh,
definitely send it.
yes. So as you said, the book is a call to action. And I actually wrote this book for someone who is newer to disability. So that could be someone who is non-disabled, who cares about justice, or it could also be a disabled person who is maybe newer on their own disability journey.
Mm,
Because this book to me, and I will say a couple of weeks ago, I did an event in Sacramento, and the person that I invited to help to moderate the book event works at an organization called Disability Rights California. So they're very much digging into the
mm,
policy and engaging there. And
right.
what I told him is, in some ways, I feel like where my book ends is where his book would begin if he were ever to
Mm,
write a book, right? So my book kind of ends with the like, okay, if you are not in policy spaces, here's how we can go up, and here's the power that you have as a citizen or as part of the public to make sure that your voice is heard. And then my hope is, and maybe the book already exists, there's a book that dives deeper into disability policy if you're already in there and you know how to navigate and influence. So the call to action here is, or I guess what I'll say is, one of my early readers described the book as a must-read for humanity. So to me, it feels very much like a primer, like something that is relatable, approachable, digestible.
It reads fast, chapters are quick,
Yes, the
very
chapters are,
accessible. Yeah.
yes, they average about 7 to 8 pages. Every chapter ends with reflection questions. And the call to action, you know, it's harder to measure a shift in attitudes. And and so oftentimes I think we are quick to jump to chapter 34, which is the last chapter of my book around getting civically engaged and policy change. But again, I think we have to go through chapters 1 through 33 in order to really believe in our whole body that the disability community, we are a valuable talent pipeline. We are the source of inspiration and so creative and adaptable because we've lived in a world that wasn't designed for us. So the call to action is that no matter who you are, I think that there is some action that we can take within our own spheres of influence to really uplift and amplify and create more respect for the disability community. And oftentimes I will take a step back. So for some people who are grassroots community organizers, that may be organizing protests or making sure they're accessible. If you are someone like me who had experience in the corporate world, it's figuring out how can we create a bridge between the corporate world and advocacy spaces, or figure out ways similar. And Microsoft is actually a wonderful example of this, uh, and especially since it came from the top too, is thinking about,
Makes a
okay,
difference. Yeah.
yeah, and for you at Microsoft and for them it was, okay, we're a technology company. What are the ways that this intersects with the disability community that we can make it more inclusive or add these tools into our products so that again, disabled people don't experience that friction. Maybe the friction could even be joining a video call, and if you are deaf or hard of hearing, not having ways to engage.
Mm,
You know, both in most video platforms now, I'm finding an option where you can turn on the captions or access a transcript.
yeah.
If you are someone who, you know, maybe gets really overwhelmed by long meetings, there are now AI tools that are incorporated that help you summarize them or help you determine what the notes are. Or you could even ask someone in the meeting or let them know to, you know, send a follow-up email afterward. So, so yeah, it was coming back to thinking, and there is one chapter that talks about privilege as a superpower in some ways.
Mm,
It's saying we have access to spaces that we have unearned privilege that, but now we have it. And so it's thinking about what do we do with it now that we have it? And what
mm.
are the spaces that we're in where we may have some influence to bring up other communities that may not have a voice or a presence in those spaces? Or how can we leverage that superpower or that privilege to create more opportunity for other communities too?
Yeah. let's end on that. But I'd love for you to explain this in more detail because privilege is a question that comes up in various contexts in social networks such as ours, network capital, that is. So explain privilege and how do you mean privilege expansion?
Mm. And I actually want to see if I can find it in the book because I have a really great quote in there.
Yeah,
Um,
as you find, let me tell the readers why I ask about this and why I want to conclude on this. Because the notion of privilege comes up anytime, like the topic of accessibility or access or equity comes up. And in my thesis on achievement, it came up in the form of achievement expansion and how AI can potentially expand achievement for a broader set of people. There are pros and cons around it. And I was thinking if we can take Tiffany's framework to apply to achievement and maybe come up with privilege expansion from the anti-ableist perspective, it might be really interesting thought experiment, philosophy experiment, and a policy handbook.
ooh, I love that phrase privilege expansion. And again, I actually just came from as we're recording this, I just came from a one-day summit on the future of disability inclusion at work. And one of the takeaways from so many of the panels was access to network,
Mm.
access to support and community. And I I hope that we are continuing to move into a conversation where, and access to community is a privilege, but it's also part of our overall well-being is having access to social connection and healthy relationships. And again, if you look at the disability community, it's one of the most isolated and excluded groups that are there. But I want to read two paragraphs, two and a half
That
paragraphs
sounds
from my
great.
book.
Yeah,
And
let's
this
do
is
it.
from a chapter called Recognize and Use Your Privilege. And before I read this quote, I also want to share that I think we've weaponized privilege. We've
Mm.
used it as a way to make people feel shame about what they have, which is why I kind of in your words, my privilege expansion is how can we flip the script on how we view privilege as a way that it is our tool in our anti-ableism toolkit. And I love that you phrase the question that way. So, so the chapter starts, it says, privilege is like air. You don't notice it until it's missing. This is why it's often so hard to recognize the privileges you benefit from. They can be as natural to you as breathing. But it's crucial to be aware of your privileges, especially in an ableist world. You have to understand how you continue to benefit from ableism before you can combat it. And then I'm going to skip a section that actually has a little bit of a checklist. We call it a non-disabled privilege checklist, which has a handful of statements around things that you don't have to speak about. And actually, maybe I'll read some of them. One of them is that ties into something we were talking about earlier. You can spontaneously attend an event, restaurant, or social outing without wondering whether the venue will be accessible to you if you have the transportation to get there, or if you'll be able to sit with everyone in your group. Uh, and then one is in the case of an emergency, you're able to evacuate a building on your own. You don't have to think twice about how to get to an in-person appointment if the building has stairs or the elevator is out of order. But okay, so and then at the end, I say the goal of this exercise isn't to make you feel bad or guilty about your privilege. That sensation is real, though, and we'll cover it in the next chapter. So the next chapter talks about turning guilt and shame into action. It's not your fault that you experience the privileges you were born into. Many privileges are unearned. However, you do have a responsibility to educate yourself and be aware of the privileges you do benefit from. Arlen Hamilton says in her book, I think when some people hear the word privilege, they get defensive. But I'm here to tell you that having privilege or being privileged is not the problem. Entitlement is the problem. Privilege is a hand-me-down heirloom rooted in the circumstances you're born into. Entitlement is something you procure and choose to wear. Another author adds, recognizing privilege simply means being aware that some people have to work much harder just to experience the things you take for granted, if they can ever experience them at all. And I also talk about, I think later in this book, about the privileges that I benefit from as well, right? And you name some of them in the recording or in our conversation. And I think that's why I come back and I think about how can I use my power and privilege to fight for more equity. And I look at, I actually heard someone say this yesterday at the summit, and they said, I don't want us to be the I don't want us to be the exception. I want us actually and the quote's so good. And I can't remember the whole thing. But that's just part of it is I'm tired of being the exception, right? Of being the only in all of these spaces. And so part of how I want to use my own privilege is to say, okay, I've had access to these spaces. How can I open up and broaden that access and opportunity to other people in my community as well?
Perhaps write a book, perhaps start a community, perhaps use the platform that you have. And you've done such a phenomenal job of that, Tiffany. Um, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't, or any parting words that you have for our listeners around the world?
Ooh, I think you did a really great job. I think it would be really fun to explore some philosophical debates around some of the concepts in the book because now you have me thinking now you have me thinking more about it.
We have a podcast focused on debates. I'm going to invite you for that, and then let's discuss this. Congratulations, Tiffany. The book is doing really well, and I hope our listeners and people who watch it check it out in the UK, US, and wherever else the book is available. Thank you so much for doing what you do, and I look forward to catching up in person very soon.
Thank you.